It's wintertime in the Ozarks. Time when the cold comes, some of the most beautiful scenery comes. Cold, clean air on the mountaintop, mile-long views. Not a time for creek wading, if you can help it. When the cold comes in these Ozarks, we have to know how to deal with it. The mountains, they crumble and wither away in its grasp. As living things, what can we do? As Alf walked along the trail, the little cabin where he had grown up came into view. He hadn't seen it for a few years, and he was certainly a different kind of person now. Easing up to the cabin, he burst through the door. He reached for his gun. The family inside, his adopted family, were terrified. He demanded money, or there was going to be blood, and they knew he wasn't kidding around. Although it had been several years since they had seen him, they know that their adopted son Alf Bolin had become a robber, murderer, and rapist. The object of the threat, for murder in this case, was the patriarch of the family himself, Old Man Blue. Old Man Blue was married to a distant cousin of mine, and unless they came up with money, Alf Bolin was going to kill him. But they didn't have any money. What was going to happen? Behind me are the famous murder rocks. Now, it was almost murder getting to these things because we had to hike about 2.5 miles through the snow to even get here. But that's not why they call them that. They're called murder rocks because back at the early part of the Civil War, this was the site, the favorite hideout for Alf Bolin and his gang of cutthroats. He had about 10 to 15 murderers that hung out with him, and they would hang out on these rocks. Why would they do this? The old wagon road that ran from Harrison, Arkansas, came right around these, went up that hill over there, went from Harrison, Arkansas to Springfield, Missouri. So they would be hiding up there in those nooks and crannies, having a perfect chance to aim their rifles out and rob travelers along this road. They killed at least 10 people here, raped many more. They didn't live here. We're going to go where they lived in just a second, but these are the murder rocks. Now when Alf Bolin wasn't at Murder Rock, most of the time him and his group lived around in here. This is Bolin Cave, and it's a lot bigger than Waterfall Cave that I was just at, but it's still not the coziest of amenities. That's one of the reasons that Alf Bolin didn't cause himself to intrude his desires upon other people in the hills around here. He just wanted to get out of this. So, what do? Alf Bolin, the cold-blooded killer's in your cabin. What strategies can you deal with? One thing that she might have done is take a look at what happens in nature around her. The first strategy that nature employs is just to let the Grim Reaper come. Show you what I mean. You take a walk in any grassland or any little prairie patch in the Ozarks in the fall or winter, you're walking through a forest of the dead. They don't always look dead, and in fact, they can look quite beautiful. Here's the little bluestem grass. Beautiful. But whether to escape from the killer throes of ice or drought, they've chosen just to have a lot of seed and let their kids deal with it. Now, had the Blue family used the first strategy of let the Grim Reaper come, Alf Bolin would have killed them all, and that would not have turned out so well. So they had to use a different strategy. Maybe they got kinky. but I was actually thinking of a different kind of kinky. Let me explain. See, in order to survive cold temperatures, living organisms have to undergo certain biochemical changes. And we see this happen, for example, with this eastern red cedar. But not just plants, animals do this too. Here we see a big brown bat in its winter hibernation, colder temperatures, and it's surviving it. Some things aren't as insulated. It's kind of stable back in a cave, but here with this bryophyte, which is just a fancy word for a moth, it's exposed on a limestone boulder. It could be buried under snow or encased in ice. All of it, even the delicate little rhizoids, right up against that bare limestone. The very things that break down the limestone, like these lichens. What's needed is a change in the fatty acids. No, fatty acids. I said acids. Here's what I'm talking about. Now, fatty acids are one of the most important types of biological molecules that we have. Why? They help make up all of our cell membranes. This is what it's composed of. And they come in different varieties. Some which are more straight-laced, which are the saturated ones, such as stearic acid. And then we have the kinkier ones. The kinks depend on how many double bonds we find throughout that carbon backbone. So why does this even matter? It all has to do with maintaining homeostasis, that stable condition that we need in order to survive. In order to survive, our cell membranes need to be pretty fluid. Proteins have to be able to move around, and if an ice crystal develops, it needs to be able to bend around that and not just break. Here we see a saturated fatty acid, and you see it has to get really hot before it turns to liquid. Whereas an unsaturated fatty acid, such as oleic acid here, turns liquid at a much lower temperature. So things that survive these cold temperatures get kinky because they make more of these twisted or bent, kinked fatty acids. That's just the way it works. So, if you're looking at strategies that Old Lady Blue could use to defeat cold blood killers, being kinky certainly wasn't one of them. After all, this was her former adopted son. Instead, she chose the option to be sweet. We see this a lot in nature. Why is that? Well, take a look at this. This is a rock face that was blasted out when the highway was widened a few years ago. The rock has begun to split away, and that's caused by the action of freezing water. When water freezes, it expands, which is devastating for rock because it has no way to deal with it. So if it splits rock, how come every winter we don't see lots of trees split in two? To answer that question, we need to learn how it actually works when water freezes. So let's look at this square dance, for example. We have water molecules and they're constantly in a state of motion. And when they form just the right arrangement, they're going to freeze. And when they do, it's going to end up making an ice crystal, which will then expand. So here we are. Now we're frozen, and as more water molecules hit this, it's just going to expand. So here's what plants do, and it's kind of brilliant. They introduce lots of sugar molecules into their fluids. Their go-to right now. See, as the water molecules move around in these colder and colder temperatures, they're going to want to form these crystalline arrangements. But because we have these goofy, wacky sugar molecules going through there, it's going to disrupt that crystal formation. There they go again. It's kind of ingenious. See, by preventing the water from freezing, you prevent it from expanding. And by preventing it from expanding, you prevent it from splitting yourself open, which is kind of useful if you want to stay alive. So let's bring this all together. What you're looking at is the range of the sugar maple tree, which employs this very strategy that I was talking about. Here's the range for the southern sugar maple, closely related species. Now, my grandfather's cousin, Cora Pinkleycall, which is pictured here, wrote about spending her childhood boiling down maple sap into maple syrup, and then finally hard maple candy, which she sold to tourists and settlers in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, around 1900. Now, she was also
a distant cousin of Old Man Blue's wife. And like most pioneer families in that day, they didn't have access to white sugar. If you wanted something sweetened, you had to either use honey or you had to work your butt off during the winter and make maple syrup or hard maple candy. For hard times, they had set a sack of this hard maple candy aside, and they offered it to Alf Bolin in lieu of the money and cash, which they obviously weren't going to have. He was satisfied with this and ate his fill. Using nature's strategy, Old Lady Blue had successfully defended herself against a cold-blooded killer, just like the maple trees do every single winter. Of course, fate would catch up with Alf Bolin. He was clubbed to death by a Union soldier in February of 1863, roughly 151 years before I started making this mini documentary. By the time they got his body to Forsyth, Missouri, it started to kind of stink, so a fellow took an axe and cut his head off. They brought his head to Ozarks, Missouri, to the town square, where townsfolk celebrated, danced around the pole, which is, as far as I can tell, the earliest documented case of pole dancing in the Ozarks. Get kinky.